Welcome, everyone. We've just started our interview for today. My name is Cindy McDonald. This is for Guided Path, and I'm so pleased to welcome you today. We see a number of people are just logging in, and we're so excited to have with us today Marie Schwartz. She is the CEO and founder of Teen Life Media. And I've been familiar with Teen Life Media for quite a number of years. And they're actually one of our partners with Guided Path. And it's a discovery platform for teen academic and experiential learning. It helps students to explore different opportunities for learning. And Teen Life's website makes it impossibly easy to find, search, and connect with programs and services that fit student interests. And particularly, their emphasis is on summer and gap year programs. And this is why I wanted to invite you, Marie, to speak with us today, because gap year is such an interesting concept and one that a lot of people are not familiar with. And so that's one of the opportunities I know that you're passionate about. Marie has been working in this space for more than 8 years and has been setting students up for success in college, but not just that, but life beyond and transitioning into the skills that they need to have a balanced, successful life. So welcome, Marie. We're glad to have you here.
I really appreciate the invitation.
So, and also, many people know I teach for UCLA. I teach online, and gap year was just a recent topic in one of my classes, and I know many other students talk about this, and we all deal with this as counselors. So can you tell me, first of all, what's the difference between a gap year and time off from school?
Well, let me back up just a little bit and sort of say and tell you that the college completion rates and anything else that a student chooses to do after college that's sort of academic, there's a real crisis right now because students aren't completing what they set out to do. So I view a gap year as a time to grow up, frankly, but it has to be done in an intentional way. So students who take a gap year can't just sit at home. Shouldn't just sit at home. They should plan, a full year of, or a semester, depending on if they got into school in January. They should really make a plan. This is a way for them to become much more self-aware. They can learn job skills. They can learn what it's like to be a minimum wage worker. They can travel. There are specific goals that you can set for yourself around getting more comfortable with communication, with being independent. Those are all, I would say a gap year is about building the life skills you need to do better and to succeed at what it is you're doing after the gap year.
I agree. That makes a lot of sense. Last week I was introduced to a concept that about we're raising a gray collar class right now, students going to college and then graduating and then not really knowing what they want to do. And so that's, I think, where gap years can make a big difference.
Yeah.
Why have gap years grown in popularity? You think that's why, or are there other reasons that it's grown in popularity?
There's lots of reasons. So I think a lot of it has to do with how our society has become dependent on digital communication. If you think about it, students are less likely to go outside and play with their friends and be creative. Everything is done online. They don't have the opportunity to really interact with people who are different than themselves. I even think, out of school activities tend to be focused on sports. I think there's less engagement in things like Girl Scouts that take children on trips and camping experiences. There's less emphasis on religious instruction. Everything is programmed, so there isn't this open-ended play anymore. And the parents have also changed. They're much more likely to micromanage their kids and not let them fail. The stakes for getting into college are much higher. So you end up with a student who really hasn't learned to advocate or to be independent and figure out stuff on their own. I happen to have gotten into this because I grew up overseas. My parents were expatriates. So I lived in foreign countries my entire childhood, and I remember going to college and thinking, wow, these students are not at all independent. And even, this was a while ago, but I had to figure a lot of things out by myself. And a gap year gives a student the opportunity to do that without sort of judgment. I think there's a lot of judging that goes on today, a lot of competitive, I have to get a good grade, or I have to be the top performer. And I think a gap year allows you to learn without all that sort of crazy judgment that goes on.
So how do colleges view a student's gap year? And how does that, some will, give deferments and some won't. So let's talk about that.
I think it's connected to financial aid decisions. So oftentimes that's something you need to check before, you say, I'd like to defer. Will that change your eligibility for financial aid? I'd say most colleges by now have figured out they're also concerned about college completion rates, and they have seen more students. I happen to be on the advisory board of the Bridge Year Council at Princeton, which is where I went to college, and they invited me to be on this advisory board. So I get lots of information about the success rate of these students, and they've now had about 5 years worth of these students going through, and what they're seeing is that these students are much more engaged when they get back. They are more likely to aspire to leadership positions on campus, and they're just more self-confident. And I think the program is doing extremely well. And they actually pay for students. They pay the entire amount, so regardless of need. So there has to be a reason why they're doing this. And I think it's because they're seeing that those students just do better when they come back. And I'd say that the statistics are that most students go to college after taking their gap year, like it's in the 96-95% level. So I don't think there shouldn't be a fear of students not going back to college.
And I think that's the key. I know for parents, that's one of their biggest concerns is if my child takes this year off, that they might not ever go back. And so how do you address that fear with parents?
Oh, I think it depends on the perspective of the parent. I think a lot of parents, feel it's a luxury, kind of like, especially if you've come to this country. Like, I'm a first generation American. I don't know if my parents would have said, yes, take a gap year. There's an emphasis on achievement, I guess. And if you have to know your kid. I think if you think that your student's ready, they're ready. If you're not sure, or the student is undecided about what they want to study, I think that's a real red flag. It's really, I read some statistics that it takes 60% of students who start a 4-year degree finish in 6 years. And every additional year of college costs about $70,000 in terms of tuition, room and board, and lost wages. So if you're not ready for college, I don't think you should rush off to college. And I think parents need to be very brutally honest about that, and because the once a student does take a gap year, their chances of completing in 4 years is much higher. So you could actually end up with less time for that whole journey than if you were to go straight to college.
That's a very good statistic to use and a good way to look at that. That makes total sense. Yeah. So how do we as counselors, there are so many, and you have all these different gap year programs on your website. How do we, evaluate the quality of a gap year?
Well, there's a few situations you have to. I can definitely talk about quality, but I think the biggest issue that prevents students from thinking about taking a gap year is budget.
Yep.
There's a few programs that offer college credit. Mm-hmm. So it's possible you can use your 529 plan money for it, or the college will, you can translate that to less college expenses down the road. So paying for a gap year is the first thing you have to think about. A lot of students will work and then go and then help save money toward some kind of a travel experience. But the industry, I'd say, is full of brilliant educators. It's a diverse, these people are educators first and business owners second. They also are very willing to provide references. There is also an association that was formed about 4 years ago called the American Gap Association, and there are programs who can be accredited by the association. The association looks for things around safety and risk management, and if a program has thought through all the potential situations and can document that they have processes and things like that. So an accredited program most definitely has a stamp of approval, but I wouldn't rule out other programs that aren't accredited. I would absolutely speak to students who've done it as well as parents. And I think parents can sometimes get information, or counselors can get information from other parents that a student might not disclose. So I would say parents are typically very honest about their child's experience and can tell you if it's worthwhile or not. I think, of course you can structure these things on your own, but someone once described, if you haven't really traveled abroad very much, it's kind of like jumping in the deep end without being able to swim. And the programs provide the structure and the support and the supervision, while letting kids live in homestay families. And it's helpful to have that kind of support and supervision. So yes, I would look at longevity of the program, the amount of students that have gone through it, ask for any kind of pre and post satisfaction surveys. They might have those, and I would speak to references. There are programs that are free. So things you can do, for example, City Year is a nonprofit that recruits students to work in inner city schools, and they're all over the country, and they pay a stipend. So, there's definitely ways of making this an affordable educational experience.
So that brings up two questions. You mentioned the American Gap Association. What about international? Is there an international Gap Association, or for people who are working in other countries or systems, is there something similar to the American Gap Year?
I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that there is a group of organizations in the UK in particular. There's a lot of students in the UK who take a gap year, and it's a much more of I would say it's less content rich, more travel, fun, experiential, and sometimes the supervision levels are different. But there are all kinds of websites out there. If you search for them, we tend to focus on the programs that American students are likely to enroll in. So there's a couple of other options that you can use. There's another organization called USA Gap Year Fairs. Host gap year fairs all over the country, and they're held in January through, I believe, March, maybe just February, but they go to many cities, like 35 different cities. That's another way you can go, and explore what's available.
I know I saw an advertisement for one that was just in Vancouver in Canada.
And if you meet with them, if you meet people with them in person, you can get a lot of other information that you wouldn't normally maybe think to ask about.
So in terms of gap years, you bring up another question, and that's, many of these are abroad in other countries and other cultures, but City Year is an example of one that you can do in in the U.S. if you're a United States student, or in their own country. So what about doing basically a stay-home gap year? Can you create your own gap year? Maybe work with a nonprofit group or something like that? How is that seen?
Absolutely. I think the key to any gap year experience is that you have to get out of your comfort zone. So doing something completely different that now you could be living at home, that's not the issue, but if you were to work, say, at a fast food restaurant and you've never done that before, I think that's a very valuable experience. It's what can you do to learn more about yourself and what you want to become, is what you really need to think about. And there's no risk to any of these experiences. There's really, you can't really make a bad decision. Obviously, you might discover something you're passionate about. Say you work in a veterinarian's office or something, and you decide, oh, wow, this is really great. I'd like to do that. That's just as valuable as working in a situation where you're doing lots of physical labor and you realize, oh my God, I really understand now that, having an education is critical. Otherwise, this is the kind of work I would need to do my entire life. And so I'd say you can craft almost anything yourself. And there are many resources in a community that allow you to reach out. So you just have to kind of get an idea of what it is you'd like to kind of pursue. I know a young man who was a bellhop at a busy hotel in Cambridge for 6 months, and it really gave him a lot of exposure to people. I'd say that's the biggest thing. Try to do something that gives you exposure to lots of different kinds of people, no matter what it is, because the school environment is usually, it's so dominated by people your own age and teachers. You don't really see people outside of that realm unless, your parents are extraordinarily social.
Right.
So it's helpful to be in a situation that's very, very different.
Well, and you brought up another good point, that it could be a combination where they could spend some time working and earning enough money to then go and do, something that was of interest to them. But I think those are very good tips, is to, create, you can create your own, get out of your comfort zone and make sure you're exposed to other people, other experiences. And then that also goes back to one of your comments earlier as well, is building your independence. If you're doing the same old and you're not reaching beyond and you're still letting your parents do all this, then you're not building that self-confidence and that independence. But that's a hard goal. That's hard for parents to embrace sometimes too.
Yeah, I think if your child says, I need to take a gap year, you should sit down and talk about it together and really articulate what the goals are. I have this presentation called The 10 Skills That Teens Need to Succeed. And you can kind of go through each one and decide where you are on the spectrum. And if, say, for example, conflict resolution, if you're not a kid who can deal with conflict, then you should look for something that will put you in a situation where you have to negotiate or discuss or mediate between people. And that's the kind of planning I would do. I would get very granular about the types of skills you want to build while you're on your gap year.
So then that was another question that I was going to ask, is what are the indications that you might look for, especially for us as counselors or advisors, that would indicate a student would benefit from a gap year? What kind of things do you see?
Absolutely. There's like 5 or 6 different kinds of students who benefit from taking a gap year. One is someone who's extremely high achieving. I think that they have been on this, intense treadmill for a while, and this is like the only year in their entire life where they might actually be able to do something else without a lot of consequences, I should say. That's one, because if you know you're going to go to grad school and so forth, or you're going to become a doctor, I think it's really important to take a breath between all these years of studying. So that's one. Another is a student who doesn't seem ready, who isn't sure what they want to study, who isn't very independent, perhaps even isn't very social. I would recommend that this student, because what you want is for that student to find their tribe when they go to college. That's one of the concerns that universities have, is students who don't connect with anyone. Those are the ones that are most likely to drop out. So I would say, any student that's hasn't completely grown up. I mean, we all know the teen brain is not fully functional. And so there are students who would benefit. And then I'm just, students who are naturally curious, who haven't traveled very much and would love to do something different. So there, students usually raise their hand if they want to take a gap year, but it's not a bad idea to suggest it to students who aren't considering it. At the end of the day, you want the student to want to do this and to be as engaged and excited about it.
Yeah.
I think speaking to other students who took a gap year from their school might actually be a great idea. And, maybe those of you who are listening who've worked with students before who have taken a gap year could be a resource for students who are considering it. Often it's the parents who are the problem, not the student.
True. That is very true. So you mentioned this 10 skills teens need to succeed. Do you have this recorded somewhere that we could, that our listeners could go to if they wanted to? And tell us about your website and how they can reach you.
Okay. So the easiest way to reach me is mschwartz@teenlife.com. So it's MSCHWARTZ. The 10 skills are a PowerPoint presentation that I will share with you, Cindy, so that you can pass it on to anybody who's on the site. It's not, well, there is a blog post, which I have to find, but you can look for it in our blog.
Okay.
So they basically consist of having a passion, something that makes you get up in the morning, developing some kind of an interest or passion. It has to do with communication, teamwork, conflict resolution. Grit is a big one. Having the grit to persevere through ups and downs. That's one of the issues I brought up at the beginning. If parents have been too much of, I think they're called snowplow parents.
Velcro parents.
Yeah, exactly. So the students like that, if they went on a wilderness kind of a trip, hiking where they have to sleep outdoors, et cetera, that's a really great way to develop grit. And then independence, being able to change a tire by yourself, or being able to book, travel reservations in a foreign, like how to get from point A to point B, figure out where you're going to go, stay, sleep, what bus to take, what train to take. And financial literacy is another one. Technical literacy is another one. So these are all kind of skills that employers are looking for. And creativity is a big one. That I would say that's probably one among the top. So I can send you some links with that information. So our website, I would encourage anyone listening to subscribe to Teen Life. Just go to the homepage, teenlife.com, and hit the subscribe button. You'll get emails from us that have lots of interesting suggestions and information. You can also go to our guides page and choose the Guide to Gap Year Programs. We publish it in a couple of different ways. The microsite, which is the first thing you get to when you click on the cover, actually has student testimonials on it. They're called student blogs, and these are students who've actually written, they've written their own testimonial about their experience. And there's quite a few on there. And you can also read our flip book, pass that link along to students, so we combine articles with listings, things like that. And then I would simply, reach out to programs that interest you and ask to speak to them. So those are all the different ways. You can also search on Teen Life. You can use just go to the homepage, click the Go button, and on the left-hand side, there's lots of filters, and you should just choose Gap Year programs, and then you can filter those further by location and so forth, and interest level, interest category, and you'll start to understand what's out there.
It is. It's a great resource. We actually feature Teen Life on Guided Path. It's one of our resources on the student dashboard for that reason, because it's such a valuable resource. And in our series that we've been doing this year of interviews, our theme is different pathways. And this is becoming more and more something that students and parents are understanding, evaluating, and many of them are planning it into their, their journey. And we're going to do a gap year, and then, go to college, they'll go through the application process and then request a deferral. And then that goes back to what part of our conversation was, is the whole financial aid. Some colleges will provide that deferral and others will not. Are you finding those numbers are increasing of colleges allowing students to defer for a gap year?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. Specifically, I can try to find out, but I do know that they're much more open to it than before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think a lot of it becomes on a case-by-case basis. But if a student's clear in communicating what they're doing, why they're doing it, what they hope to get out of it, colleges are very amiable to that and would be very encouraging. So that's, I expect that trend is going to continue and increase. And so being able to know what gap year programs are, what they encompass, how to assess the quality of them is definitely something that we as counselors and advisors want to be able to do. So thank you for providing that as a resource. And I know this is an area that you're very passionate about, and that comes through in what you say and what you share. So anything else that we'll post this so everyone, you'll get a link to this recording so you can listen to it again. Do we have any questions? I see we might have a couple of questions, so let's go to questions. So here's a question from Kurt. Do students need to reapply if they choose at the last minute to take a gap year? So they've applied to college and then they decide, okay, I'm not ready to go. Now do I have to reapply?
No, they should just ask to be deferred for a year, but they do need to get the college's approval. So they don't have to apply again. In fact, I would recommend that students apply to college before they leave, before they go on their gap year, rather than during or at the end of their gap year, because they want, you need the teacher's recommendations, and if you're not there, it's harder to remember you.
Sure.
The whole process just takes a little longer, but definitely.
It does, but the students fall into all those different situations. I know I had a student who ended up doing that exact thing. She applied to colleges all along. We were exploring gap year. We always knew it was a possibility. She had a lot of major things happen in her senior year, and the gap year ended up being, she was a Rotary Exchange student. And so then she came back and then reapplied, and the colleges that she had been admitted to were no longer really appropriate for her based on her.
I think that's the more likely scenario, right? That you discover something about yourself while you're away and say, I don't really want to go to this college anymore. So yes, you don't need to reapply, but you could apply to new colleges.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I understood the question correctly, but the colleges you've already applied to, you don't need to apply to again if you tell them that you're leaving.
Right. That's exactly right. So, it all comes to communicating and being transparent in whatever you're doing. Okay, so
if you think it's a real possibility that you're going to do this, then I would ask the college before you apply how they feel about gap year programs.
Right.
Gap years.
Right. So Anne asks, she says, one question I get is losing scholarship opportunities if you defer for a gap year.
Yeah, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about that. I think you have to really talk to each individual college or university about that. I don't think they all behave the same way.
I agree. Some will save the scholarship and others will not. I know here in California, it's a lot harder with UC. They typically won't defer and they won't keep the scholarships. So it really depends on the college or the system. But you can come back and reapply, as a student. And your gap year makes you a stronger student. It makes you a much more desirable student because you're bringing in things. You have things to write about in your personal statements that set you apart from other students. And I think that's also part of the benefit of doing a gap year too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about the students? Stephanie asked, well, when students come back, are they more mature than a typical sophomore or just more mature than they were before they took the gap year?
That's a very good question. I definitely think they're more mature than before they took a gap year, much more. So, depending on where they started, what 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 I see happening is that students who have taken a gap year, they like to get together with other students who took a gap year. They're like there's these little support groups that form at colleges of students who have done that. Because as someone who lived abroad, I remember coming to university, not really being able to talk to anyone about my life or my experiences because I was the only one who had gone through it. So I think with the diversity today of the college, the student body, that isn't as much of an issue anymore because there's lots of international students who probably feel the same way. I was also an exchange student in Germany after college, and I remember, gravitating to students who were also foreign. So somehow, yes, the students are more mature than when they left, but that doesn't mean that they can't relate to people in their class. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. There are other students like them that will be able to understand what they did.
Right. I agree. And now
just because they're more mature means that they can handle more extracurricular activities. Like they're more likely to attend class. They're more likely, to be focused, and they really understand why, the value of the education that they're getting post gap year. So I think they're more engaged in the university life after that.
That's true. That's very true, because they've been able to get a broader perspective, and they have a much deeper perspective of what education is about sometimes. Mm-hmm. So how about colleges that you don't get into, go on a gap year and then reapply to those?
Absolutely. I know a student who got into Harvard that way. Mm-hmm. But that's an exception, right? I mean, Harvard, I think they actually write in their acceptance letters, we encourage you to take a gap year, because they know that the students there who are applying there are probably very, very stressed out. Mm-hmm. But absolutely, I mean, it just means that I think if you think you're going to be a better applicant after the experience, or while you're at the experience, absolutely, like you said, writing about your college essay will be that much different. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of other questions, and there's some financial aid questions that if we don't get time to cover, I'll cover, because some of these I can answer as well. But what about graduate school programs? Do they appreciate gap years? Do students sometimes take gap years between undergrad and graduate school?
I'm glad you brought that up. I don't know how graduate schools feel about it. I do know that people are taking, students who are going on to med school, I think especially if they take a gap year that somehow has a health angle, they might be working in a clinic or something, that's an extremely good experience. There's a program called Winterline that runs for 9 months, and I know a student who did that because she knew she was just going to be, slammed when she got back. So that's what I did, actually. I took a gap year after college in Germany, as I mentioned, and it was wonderful. It really gave me a chance to breathe and experience and learn and make friends. I mean, friends I still have today. So I highly recommend a gap year before or even after college. I mean, when I went to college, the semester abroad wasn't as common. Mm-hmm. So that, or summer experiences abroad maybe weren't as common as they are now. One of my sons went on a program to Shanghai over the summer that his college offered, and I think he got as much out of that as he would have had he taken a gap year. So it's important to get that out of comfort zone experience at some point. I think it makes you a better candidate for anything you choose to do.
So what about, is it common, Shelley asked is it common for students to take a gap year after their freshman, sophomore year? And what do you recommend for advising students interested in that approach?
Obviously, you should take time off when you feel it would benefit you the most. I think students who, I think it's better to do it in a planned way than perhaps an unplanned way. I know students who have taken a semester off and done archaeological digs and things like that. But then they felt anxious about rejoining, catching up so they could rejoin their classmates. I think that's the one issue I would see. The student who I know who took a semester off, he then had to take a summer semester to catch up on his classes so that he could graduate with his class. But obviously, if, any time is a good time.
So what is the difference between then a study abroad and a gap year?
Well, study abroad, you're getting college credit. You're actually taking classes and you're paying tuition for it. So it's part of your, educational experience. Whereas a gap year, there's no, it doesn't have to be graded. It's not necessarily college credit. It's much more about life skill building and not academic learning.
And so then that relates to one of the other questions about, well, do you work with the study abroad office to choose to take their gap year internationally? If you're working with study abroad office, you're doing study abroad, right? Which is not necessarily the same. And that brings us back to one of the points that I meant to ask earlier. You talked about, well, some gap years will allow you to get college credit. Well, wouldn't that impact your process when you get, to college? If you come with credit, would that make you possibly a transfer student?
No, it's not that much credit.
Okay.
The other thing is the programs with college credit, the college credit may not be accepted by the college you're going to. So it's important to check, with them before you think that you can automatically get these credits. I think they're just saying that their program has perhaps a little bit more learning to it than maybe there's a specific academic focus to the program that might not otherwise be there. But it's important to note that, a program with college credit doesn't necessarily mean that you get that the college you're going to will accept those credits.
Agreed.
It doesn't replace a year or a semester of college.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that becomes a question that oftentimes parents will ask, and then having that and understanding that and being able to communicate that, then that becomes our role as counselors and advisors. And that's why as professionals, knowing as much about all these different options is so important, and why we do what we do. And it's so hard when you're in as a public school. Here in California, our student counselor ratio is like 1 to 1,000. So I would never have the time to do this and cover these kinds of things with my students at the public school. So I appreciate being able to do that, and have an expert like yourself to be able to share that. And that's why we do these interviews. So thank you, Marie.
You're welcome.